Hello everyone, kia ora koutou, and thank you for coming. I hope you find it worthwhile. Thank you, Chris, for your kind introduction, and I hope to manage the balance between the expertise and ensuring that everybody does understand what I'm talking about and what I look into. I'd also like to thank colleagues from Marketing and Communications, Katie Warriner and Hugh Jones. Without their support and guidance, this evening would definitely not have happened. Professorial lectures are an opportunity to reflect more deeply than usual, to draw together big themes, and to see if they can throw light on the detail of our daily life. Alternatively, we can start with that messy detail and see if there is a grand theory to help us make sense of it all. And I do mean it all, life in general. So that is the small task that I have set for us this evening. Let me start by identifying strands of my life that have made me who I am and which, as I will explain, provide the unique resources upon which I draw every day. I have a mixed heritage and I am blessed with a big fat Greek family from Cyprus, as well as a much smaller and less exuberant English family. I was the first in all of my extended family to go to university. I did read law, as Chris said, which was an acceptable degree to everyone at the time. I'm the proud mother of 2 adult children. I have a daughter and a son who's here with me tonight, and I was a single parent for the vast majority of their childhood. I have lived abroad for 2 extended periods in my life. First as a teenager, when I lived in the US and Canada, and secondly, as an adult, when I did take my 2 children to New Zealand, a country where I still live as a permanent resident, if only for a few weeks a year right now. I'm used to multiple identities. By way of example, I did the census within 3 months of arriving in Auckland, and that box that I tick in the UK isn't there. You know, British is not on the New Zealand census. So I had to work out who or what was I. And it turned out that my new identity was Pakeha, which is the Māori name for New Zealander of European descent, or at least that's the polite version. After university, I followed my father into business, starting as he did as a sales rep. While I loved the freedom of planning my calls and managing my territory, I found the life a bit too lonely. That doesn't mean to say that I was alone or that the 9 months I spent on the road were uneventful, but the interaction between rep and buyer is quite a particular one. I certainly learned a lot from the experience. I'll bet that no one else here has been sworn at by a parrot announcing the arrival of another friendly rep, and after managing a number of awkward encounters with, shall we say, inappropriately frisky buyers, I decided I would be safer in an office environment and join the marketing department. Of course, as a woman working in an alpha male office environment in the 1980s, that was not exactly what we might call safe these days. But I'm prepared to admit that I thoroughly enjoyed working in the hedonistic heyday of the London advertising scene and being responsible for multi-million-pound budgets in those days. After a few moves from one blue chip to another, I learned something that the books don't tell you. Business is cyclical, and in downturns, the first function out the door is always marketing. The second time that happened to me was in the early 90s, and I was a single mother with a small daughter, and I needed a job. A former work colleague of mine suggested that I join him at Bristol Business School. As an academic, I thought, seriously, me? I figured it would keep the wolf from the door and see me through the recession, and then I would return to a real job. But I quickly found my feet and have truly enjoyed my time in academia and consider it a privilege to have one of the most important real jobs going. Having spent my time in practice selling and marketing fast-moving consumer goods, I suddenly had to learn all the theories behind the practice. I got through the first year much as every new lecturer does by being 1 chapter ahead of the students. And this worked okay for the undergraduates. But my years of practice suddenly made me the perfect choice for the MBA program. Suddenly, the textbooks, which were very much based on the marketing of products, weren't any help to me when trying to relate theory to the students from Rolls-Royce, the MOD, professional services, the NHS and charities, and these were the majority of my new students. The classic 4 Ps of marketing, product, price, place, and promotion, weren't helpful in business-to-business situations and didn't explain service encounters at all. I needed more than a new textbook, I needed some new theory. Fortunately, the field of services marketing had been developing since the late 1980s, led by practitioners and researchers within banking, and had become accepted as a subdiscipline of marketing. It's important to remember that it was a subdiscipline of marketing. Their research introduced the importance of people, process, and physical evidence, and brought a richness of understanding and a robust framework to explain how customers evaluate their service encounters, particularly the poorer ones. Research and theory development during the 1980s and the 1990s focused upon identifying, understanding, and resolving management problems associated with the characteristics and nature of service provision, particularly those arising from the reliance upon personal interactions. Much of this research requires a cross-disciplinary approach. Managing employees involves human resources management, and service design and delivery draws upon operations management. Indeed, the effective management of service organizations is an area where these 3 management disciplines combine to develop knowledge very happily for the benefit of practitioners. And this theory served me well for several years. It was during this rather settled period of my life that I led the marketing department at Bristol Business School and completed my PhD, which examined the switching and loyalty behaviour of clients of UK law firms. During that research, I was struck by the different ways in which private clients and commercial clients described their experiences, and also how they were viewed by lawyers, and I will return to that observation later. Then along came an article by Steve Vargo and Bob Lush in the Journal of Marketing. While hugely influential, their service-dominant logic thesis remains a controversial contribution to marketing theory, and this is where my research interest lies. Remarkably, it was my move to Auckland that cemented my commitment to service-dominant logic and co-creation. I had hardly gotten off the plane before I was surrounded by visiting marketing professors. Far from being a small, sleepy place a long way away, New Zealand is an incredible draw for leading academics who want to spend their winter working in the sunshine of Auckland or Dunedin. December to March is generally a frantic time spent hosting a range of intellectually stimulating debates, seminars, workshops, conferences and symposia, or even a morning tea with world-leading academics. Within 3 months, I had met and started to work with Christian Grönroos, a leading professor from Finland, who my marketing colleagues will have heard of. And then, who turned up but Vargo and Lush, while service-dominant logic was still an embryonic notion. The marketing department at Otago University is crammed with very astute folks, mainly out of the UK, many from Scotland, who recognise the value of leading a global discourse in a controversial area, so created the Otago Forum series to debate and develop the logic, as we say. So in many ways, I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to get involved. I would also acknowledge the tremendous debt I owe to the wonderfully welcoming academic environment within New Zealand, without which I truly would not be standing here tonight. So to co-creation. Co-creation has become a relatively common term used in organisations in both the public and private sector, and even charitable organisations talk about doing it. In fact, I'm willing to bet that many of you here tonight have used the phrase. Now, not wishing to embarrass anyone, but I wonder how many of you have a robust framework in mind to implement the co-creation you aspire to. Are you clear about what your co-created outcome will be and what to focus on to achieve it, or what barriers you might encounter? If not, then maybe I can help. And as a heads up, I will be checking in with you at the end just to see if I've managed to do that. The framework that I use for co-creation is the service-dominant logic thesis proposed by Vargo and Lush. In simple terms, service-dominant logic, or SDL, is concerned with how parties to exchange integrate their resources to co-create value. However, each aspect of this requires further explanation, particularly in light of the controversy that surrounds the role of value. And I'll say up front that the contribution that I and my research colleagues have made to the SDL debate is also controversial, because we disagree with Vargo and Lush on what it is exactly that is co-created. What I will present this evening is an explanation of the model that I have developed with my co-authors, who I wish to acknowledge. Tim Hughes is a professor of marketing at the Bristol Business School at the University of the West of England, and David Chalcraft was a colleague of mine at Westminster Business School, University of Westminster, who now works at the University of Bedfordshire. Together we propose that service co-creation comprises planned resource integration behaviours by actors with the intention to realise a value proposition. There are a number of interlinked concepts here: service, actors, resources, value, integration, co-creation, and I need to explain each one. So let's start with the service-dominant logic thesis that the basis for all exchange is service, not goods. So if you remember that services marketing was deemed to be a subdiscipline of marketing, we're actually reframing the whole of the lens through which we look at marketing now. So Vargo and Lush reposition goods as a subset of service, rather than services being a special application of marketing principles. This means that manufactured goods exist only to facilitate self-service provision. So we use our washing machines to perform a laundry service at home, and our cars facilitate our personal transportation needs. And I would watch that market over the next few years and see how that develops. This remains controversial, and it is an important distinction with which I agree. It is important to note that service here is singular, not plural, and is defined as using one's resources for the benefit of another person or entity. One of the foundational principles of service-dominant logic is that all actors are resource integrators. Right now, at this moment, you are actors integrating your resources, and I'll explain how later. Actor is the preferred title for all service participants, including customers, and this means that unlike economic theory, service-dominant logic envisages an active role for customers. This reframing of the customer role is one of the more important strands of the service-dominant logic contribution. Customers are not passive entities to be done to, but they are important and necessary partners that we need to work with, to collaborate with, to achieve a successful outcome. So remember the difference I mentioned between how private clients and commercial clients describe their experiences. The SDL reframing of the customer role as an active participant helped me to make sense of that research finding many years later, because it was clear that private clients were describing being done to, while commercial clients viewed the relationship as a collaborative, working with or doing together partnership. And we can draw a number of conclusions as to why that might be, all of which might be resolved by private client lawyers adopting a more collaborative approach to recognise the client as a more important partner. I digress, though it's always worth considering the extent to which we might be doing to or doing with those that benefit from our service provision. Thirdly, we need to understand the service-dominant logic categorization of resources, and I believe that the separation of resources into two fundamental types is one of the most insightful contributions of service-dominant logic. Operand, with a D, resources, such as raw materials, are resources on which an operation or an act is performed to produce an effect. This type of resource is usually tangible, inert, and passive, requiring input from an active agent in order to realize its value potential. Operant resources with a T are those that are employed to act on operand resources and on other operant resources in order to realize value. These are usually intangible resources such as knowledge, skills, and labor, having the expertise, capability, motivation, and capacity to do something, and includes the tacit knowledge of all actors. Tacit knowledge is the unwritten, unspoken, hidden understanding that we all have and is often shared among a group of actors. Established groups benefit from tacit knowledge, and this can amount to a core competency that becomes a competitive advantage. However, there is a high risk that understandings can be lost, which may result in the loss of that competitive advantage. Service-dominant logic argues that operant resources are the main source of competitive advantage, and this has raised interest in the nature of intangible resources and how we develop our knowledge, skills, and social capital. The fact that operant resources are possessed by individuals emphasizes the participatory role of all actors. The operant resources that actors draw on are social, cultural, and physical. Social resources take in the support of friends, family, commercial, and professional networks. Cultural resources include our specialized knowledge and skills, and physical resources relate to individual endowments, for example, physical strength or skill and dexterity. All are increasingly important as service organizations focus on understanding customer diversity, and that can be in the very simple example of aging. Our dexterity and eyesight changes as we age, and we all bring different social and cultural resources to all of our interactions. It is this focus on operant resources, along with resource integration by actors, that is so interesting to me. It has changed the way we think about customers. They are not inert, passive vessels into which we pour the value that we create and deliver. Customers possess resources that enterprises need. Those resources have value potential. Because co-creation requires the customer to apply their resources, it is essential that organizations understand what resources their customers will need to apply and the extent to which all or some of those customers might possess them. Some resources are made explicit, such as the amount of money needed, and others are much less obvious, such as motivation or prior knowledge. Generally, the operand resources will be explicit because of their tangible nature. An operant will be less obvious. Crucially, this requires an understanding of operant resource capabilities, which will be tacit and hidden, such as dexterity, eyesight, or prior knowledge. Only then will it be possible for a service provider to define the most appropriate customer segments to target and to design the service to enable their participation. And this brings us to the whole arena of value, which is both complex and controversial. So let's start with the simple bits. Service-dominant logic specifically rejects the prevailing economic theory of exchange that value is somehow embedded in objects and delivered to customers. Customers are not passive consumers of value that is created and delivered by organizations. Instead, value can only be determined by beneficiaries at the point of use, consumption, or experience of the product or service, the point at which their resources are integrated with that of the service provider to achieve a desired outcome. This is the notion of value in use, which some of you may have heard of. So if enterprises cannot and do not deliver value, what role do they play? The SDL position is that organizations offer value propositions, which have no intrinsic value and require the integration of resources from other actors for value to be realized. In this context, the value proposition must promise outcomes that are perceived to be valuable by customers and make it worthwhile for them to apply their resources to achieve the outcome. The resources that we all individually possess represent our value potential. So all those things I mentioned at the beginning about what makes me, me, the learning from those experiences is part of my value potential. And you will have an equally wide range of experiences that will drive your unique value potential. The imperative for collaboration has led some authors to use the terms co-production and co-creation interchangeably, as if they were both synonymous with resource integration. However, Vargo and Lush clearly identify two separate concepts. They associate co-creation with value and co-production with the customer performance of tasks to achieve the service provision. They are quite clear. Co-production is the participation of the customer in creating the core offering, the service itself. My colleagues and I agree that co-production and co-creation are two entirely different concepts, and we also agree that only co-production is synonymous with resource integration. However, we go further and suggest that replacing the phrase co-production with resource integration will add clarity for academics and practitioners and halt confusion between co-production and co-creation. Resource integration itself is a more fundamental notion than co-production because it includes the activities and contributions of all actors, not just customers, and it is consistent with the SDL position that all actors are resource integrators. We argue that if all actors are resource integrators, it is difficult to justify the need for a construct that focuses entirely on the tasks performed by a specific group of actors. Furthermore, one of the beauties of SDL for me is the universal application of its principles. But how, for instance, in a joint venture, would you identify the customer-led activities for co-production? So it's for these reasons that our model uses the resource integration terminology, and we do not talk about co-production. Moving on, it's worth noting that if operant resources really are the fundamental basis for competitive advantage, then the resources that employees and customers bring to the organization are more important than the operand or tangible resources that the organization has. Operand resources can be copied and reproduced far more easily than operant resources, which can be more specialized, unique, and specific to a person or group of people. This is why people truly are the most important asset that any organization has. But that also represents a challenge. Effective resource integration requires the management of at least two resource integrators, customers and employees, and raises the question of how far the enterprise is in a position to manage customers over whom it has far less control than its employees. This is a huge challenge to us within higher education context, where we rely on our students to co-create learning outcomes, many of whom experience multiple pressures which impact on their ability or willingness to engage by applying their resources. Enterprises adopt segmentation strategies to attract customer resources. Essentially, they seek customers who offer them value potential and customers are engaged in the same process. The fact that enterprises are the actors that are more likely to be active in advertising their resources and managing their value propositions should not stop us from viewing this as a two-way process. We could consider value propositions to be a process of negotiation between and among actors. Participating actors must be able and willing to contribute their resources to realize the value proposition. For enterprises, value propositions represent a mechanism for offering their resources to a given market to attract the resources of customers or other actors to achieve value. Without the contribution of appropriate resources from customers, value propositions would remain just that. So value propositions provide all actors with a means to identify where best to apply their resources. Another complicating factor is that actors' resources are not static. Explicit in our conceptualization of service co-creation is the notion that learning takes place during the resource integration process and results in the modification of the resources the actors possessed prior to collaboration. In some cases, this is the purpose of resource integration, and education would be a good example, but there are lots of other examples. I'm old enough to remember the first Gulf War and the impact that had on airlines. British Airways decided to run a huge promotion to get people flying again. I wonder if anyone else here remembers the chaos caused by their 50,000 free international flights promotion, which was notorious in the 1990s. Many people who had never flown before won free seats in the lottery and turned up en masse to airports around the world to travel to or from London on the 23rd of April. It was a one-day promotion. Now, I'm willing to bet that most of us have flown before and are therefore reasonably competent airport users. I don't want to brag much, but this is an aspect of my life where I personally excel. But have you ever considered the tacit knowledge involved in getting yourself from your airport drop-off point to your aircraft seat on time? Or off the plane and out the other side accompanied by your luggage? No? Well, unfortunately, neither had British Airways, and April the 23rd did not run smoothly at all. Passengers without passports were turned away, as were those who turned up too late, and many staff lost breaks as they went hunting for passengers who were lost somewhere between the check-in and the departure gate. Unfortunately for BA and some of their new customers, many planes flew with abundant, unplanned, empty seats. So co-creation can be a learning experience, and what we learn from each of our experiences enhances our value potential as future resource integrators. In other words, we become better customers. Our value potential to the organization grows too. Some enterprises recognize that and explicitly treat newbies differently from their more experienced customers. For example, in higher education, one aim is to develop the independence of students over time. So the proportion of independent learning expected of the student increases over the period of the degree. Module design and style of teaching takes this into account too. Enterprises may need to consider the extent to which their customers are going through a learning process as a result of the resource integration process and ensure that the resources they offer to customers reflects their likely changing needs. Organizations may also need to consider how the value proposition might need to change to retain customers. Alternatively, organizations might use this knowledge to implement tightly targeted market segmentation strategies. The modification of resources and their value potential illustrates the complexities inherent in the iterative nature of service co-creation and the multiple opportunities that beneficiaries of service have to evaluate and re-evaluate the value realized. So to the biggest area of controversy. What is co-created. Vargo and Lush are absolutely clear. It is value that is co-created. My colleagues and I are equally adamant. It is service that is co-created and definitely not value. Value co-creation has been a popular topic for SD logic discourse among academics, but it has not resulted in clarity or a shared understanding. In part, this is due to an ontological dilemma between objectivist and relativist positions. So let's start with what Vargo and Lush say about value. First, we've already seen that they reject the traditional economic utility model of value that adopts the objectivist ontological position. They do not agree that suppliers embed value in goods and services which are delivered to customers who consume that value. Service-dominant logic stresses that value can only be achieved by the actor that benefits from the use, consumption, or experience, the value in use notion. SDL also states that value is a phenomena that is idiosyncratic, experiential, contextual, and meaning-laden, and that value is always uniquely and phenomenologically determined by the beneficiary. From this perspective, value is relative, depending on situational, personal, and comparative factors. Rather than being a characteristic of objects, value emerges from the subject's interaction with the object and is consistent with the value being the outcome of an evaluative judgment or a summative evaluation. The clear implication being that value is an evaluative judgment outcome of the service output or experience and unique to the individual, a personal perception. So SDL specifically rejects the objectivist position and couches all explanation of value within a relativist domain. My colleagues and I entirely agree with this relativist position. So here's the dilemma. The unique and personal nature of the evaluation described by SDL appears to me to be incompatible with the notion that it can be co-created by two or more actors. If value is an individual and personal perception of the benefit gained from service, how can it be co-created? One of the difficulties with the SD logic conceptualization of value co-creation is the implication that all actors involved in co-creation might gain value, or that value automatically accrues to actors as a result of service. Moreover, value co-creation implies an element of inseparability of the customer from the enterprise. I believe that separating the evaluation of value from service co-creation addresses these problems. I therefore argue that while all actors might engage in behaviours to achieve service provision, the service output will not have been experienced or evaluated by any two actors in the same way. Conceptualizing value as an evaluative judgment, an independent but connected outcome from service experience that is realized over time, emphasizes the relativist nature of value and recognizes that value may be multiple and mutable as perceptions change with experience. This is consistent with the iterative nature of service and the argument that resource integration results in resource modification that influences the value potential of an actor's resource. This would certainly be the case with higher education. An undergraduate on a degree course will have a perception of the value of the course at the time that it is delivered, based upon their experience at the time. 5 years later, when that individual has had the opportunity to gain employment or promotion and apply the learning from the course to practice, they may have a different perception of the value of their studies. So my colleagues and I argue that while service is co-created, value is not. Value is realized by the individual as an evaluative judgment of the benefit or the worth against criteria derived from personal values. We also argue that value is realized from a proposition through resource integration behaviors associated with use, consumption, or experience. It can be multiple, mutable, and separated from the service and other actors temporally and spatially. In summary, we argue that it is service that is co-created. We define service co-creation as the planned resource integration behaviours by actors intended to realise a value proposition. We recognise the iterative nature of service when proposing that resource integration modifies actors' resources. The modification of actors' resources will, in turn, modify the value potential of those resources. Essentially, actors learn to become better resource integrators and increase their attractiveness to the market. We also highlight the importance of the value proposition as both an explicit statement of the value that might be realised from service co-creation and an implicit statement of the resources required by all actors. Value propositions serve as a mechanism for actors to attract the resources of other actors. This position recognises the relativist nature of value while maintaining the core messages of service-dominant logic, that customers are active actors in the service process, that resources of all actors have value potential, that all actors are resource integrators, and that co-creation takes place when actors' resources are integrated. Let's take the case of higher education. We can see a range of value propositions in the marketplace to attract applicants who have a variety of secondary level qualifications, evidencing differentiated resources. The competitive nature of the market has led to value propositions that go beyond just the qualification that students might gain. Some courses in universities choose to emphasise employability outcomes, others student satisfaction or a specific student experience. Others, research credentials or other reputational matters. The whole application process evidences the negotiation of value propositions between universities and applicants. Does this applicant have the resources needed to succeed on our course? Will success on this course at this university enhance my chances of getting the career I want? Will I become more attractive to an employer of my choosing? We design our courses and curricula with a view to the resources students arrive with and need to develop, along with the needs of future employers. Frequently, we do this in conjunction with employers in order to understand the value proposition the student will need to demonstrate to future employers. The learning process requires the student to integrate those resources with those of the university. Hopefully, the outcome of that resource integration will be the learning, which will result in the enhancement of the student's operant resources. Learning takes place as the result of a series of service experiences over a prolonged period of time, where there are many opportunities for the student to enhance their resources and evaluate their experiences. Until realised as an outcome of application, the enhanced resources represent value potential for the student or graduate. The realisation of the value of these enhanced resources may occur during the period of study or sometime thereafter when they achieve their personal and professional goals through the application of those enhanced resources. This can be in the form of gaining the required knowledge, skills and capabilities to undertake assessments and to achieve the qualifications they seek, and/or through the achievement of a job or a promotion. Anecdotally, we know that students frequently only fully realise the value of their learning long after they graduate, or at least their evaluation of the value changes depending upon their goals and achievements. In this case, value realisation can be seen to have a temporal dimension. There is the initial evaluation made by the student, which is recorded in the National Student Survey, the NSS, which is currently going on, folks. But the student will continue to evaluate the value of their learning throughout their career. And that ongoing evaluation will take place without any further integration with the university. So that value realisation will also have a spatial dimension. Perhaps universities should run a national alumni survey. I think it would be very interesting to compare the results with the NSS. So does my research help me in my role as an academic leader? Has it changed me? I would say that it gives me a very particular perspective because I actively think about what has been, is being, and might be created, co-created. What outcome do I or we want? What resources are needed to achieve that, and who has access to the knowledge, skill, or experience that we need? I also consider how the experience of participating in, leading or contributing to an activity will enhance the knowledge, skills, and specialist expertise of all the actors. Understanding someone's ambitions become important in this context to ensure that they have access to the experiences from which they will develop and evidence their expertise. In short, I've become pretty focused on developing people, including myself, for the benefit of the organisation. I have drawn on my research whenever I have moved into significant new roles and experienced what is referred to as imposter syndrome, that feeling that you don't really deserve the role because there are others who might be better at one or more aspect of what you do. The most acute occasion was my role as Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Transfer at Westminster Business School. Research and knowledge transfer were probably the two weakest areas of my CV in terms of personal achievement at that time. But the appointment panel were clearly courageous and gave me the opportunity to prove myself. I put my research to the test and focused entirely on the resources that we had, the expertise, tacit knowledge, and the willingness. I identified what we needed to do along with the gap and set out to close that gap through planned resource integration to build capacity and capability within the team. Along the way, I've learnt that academic leadership is about creating the environment in which others flourish and are able to contribute their talents most effectively. I do not have to be the best teacher, the best researcher, course leader, or subject group leader, but I do need to recruit, develop, and retain the best. My role is to encourage, acknowledge, and reward excellence. Team leadership, in my view, is akin to conducting the orchestra and not being a frustrated first violinist. I've also learned the value of codifying or writing down as much of the tacit knowledge that we have individually and within teams. Not only does it help with transparency of decision-making, but it builds the competencies of the whole team and increases our individual ability, thereby building capacity and capability. Codifying tacit knowledge modifies, read enhances, the resources of team members faster than providing experiences that develop tacit knowledge. Sometimes we need to experience things for ourselves to truly understand or embed the knowledge that we have, and that is the real value of experiential learning. So we need both. Most of all, I've learned the value of diversity, particularly the diversity that comes with the lived experience. Everyone has a rich background, which has endowed them with their own special expertise. In my last role as Dean of the Glasgow School for Business and Society, I was involved with outreach activities at Castle Milk High School in Glasgow, which is a deprived part of Glasgow, where I saw some astonishing talent. I encouraged those youngsters to consider where they came from as what makes them interesting and unique. An asset to draw upon and not a limitation on their future. So now it's time to check your understanding of co-creation, and this does require some audience participation, please. Can we have some lights? Thank you. Now, I've picked something that just the same as my A*+++ airport user. I know you're good at this, okay? You've been practicing this bit since you were 5 years old. So, we're going to use hands up here. Hands up if you formed a view of what is co-created. Come on, folks. Right, okay. Even if you think it's value, I won't agree with you, but I'd be happy if you thought it was value or I've got Hugh's problem. Thank you, Hugh. I've just gone totally blank. I'll stick to reading. Right, okay. Keep your hands up if you're actually confident that you know what to focus on if you want to achieve a co-created outcome. Who knows what to focus on? Great. And what barriers there might be to success. Fantastic. So finally, I started this lecture by saying that we would be looking at the bigger picture, at life itself, and hopefully we did. After all, life itself starts with co-creation. A sperm is not exchanged for an egg, but only when an egg and sperm combine their resources does life begin. And we are all the extraordinary products of co-creation. Thank you.